Welcome. Welcome to our closing plenary of the day, which is about science journalism, pseudoscience, and reporting in authoritarian regimes. Last year, the program, so my name is Deborah Blum. I'm the program committee chair for the World Conference. I'm the director of the Night Science Journalism program at MIT. And last year, the program committee received this proposal from two Mexican journalists, Oscar Miyamoto and Rodrigo Perez. And at the time that they proposed it, it was not a plenary. But at the time that they proposed it, the United States had just gone through an election sea change. And so we started talking in the program committee about the global nature of authoritarian regimes. Following the election of Donald Trump, here in the United States, we began to see signs of that kind of approach to government in the United States. And in the past year, we have been forced to reconsider that even further. If you have not been following American politics, or if you have, you may remember that this year we had a journalist arrested for asking our U.S. Secretary of Health questions that made him uncomfortable. We have had government scientists who have been blocked from presenting their work if that is counter to the information that our government wants to be seen made public. We have, when we report stories accurately, and I'm going to say accurately, on these events, the U.S. media is often labeled fake news, and the stories that we are telling are dismissed. And in fact, I want to mention two other things that we've seen. The U.S. journalists have been described by our president as enemies of the people. And at the Republican convention in Minnesota last year, one of the most popular t-shirts sold was a t-shirt that said, "Tree Rope Journalist," and had a picture of a noose hanging from a tree calling up the lynchings from the old American South. So we're at a time in which we're seeing the government take steps that are familiar to people who live in authoritarian regimes, try to demonize the media, and try to dismiss the stories we want to tell. So my point really is that we feel it's exceptionally important, not only in countries, for us to learn from countries that have experience with this, and for us to recognize that we're at a time in which journalists need to think about how they tell their stories well during a time of often repressive regimes. And I am not suggesting to you that science journalists face the risks that some journalists do. I was looking at the statistics gathered by the reporters, the Committee for Protection of Journalists. This year so far, 30 journalists have been killed doing work. A little over half of them were classified as murdered by the committee. Last year, it was closer to 50. This year isn't over. So it's not that we're facing those stresses, but at a time that stories of science, environment, health are critical to public understanding, that they're going to shape policy for decades to come, policy that may or may not protect all of us, including the planet. The stories that we need to tell can seem under threat. So I have 5 wonderful journalists here from around the world who are going to talk about some of the experiences in their countries dealing with just those problems, and talk about how effective they've been in trying to get important stories out. To my right is Mohammed Yahya, who is an executive editor at Nature Research Middle East. Next to him is, I just need to get my notes together here, Dina Rakbianacu, who is an Indonesian journalist, a writer for both SciDev and Nature. She's a freelancer. Next to Dina is Jason Clark, a science writer from Costa Rica. Next to Jason is Carla Almeida, a science journalist from Brazil. And next to Carla is Sarah Wild, who is a freelance science journalist in South Africa. They all have important, revealing, illuminating, and somewhat alarming stories to tell us. And so I hope you'll give them your full attention. We're going to start with Mohammed and just go down the list, and afterwards we'll open it up for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah, and thank you everyone for being here for the last plenary. It's always an exciting time. So I will talk about a little experience that we've had in Egypt a couple of years ago. And but first, I think I'd like to start with a little background. So a couple of years ago, you might remember that the UN celebrated the Year of Light, and that was particularly exciting for me because that was the 1,000-year celebration of when a well-known polymath from the Islamic Empire called Ibn al-Haytham, Latinized to al-Hazan, wrote his breakthrough book on optics, and that was basically how we learned how optics work, how the eyes work. It completely changed the previous understanding of how that worked, and it led to the camera obscura, which is all interesting and great. But what I find really enduring about the legacy of Ibn al-Haytham is not his discoveries as much as his approach to science. So these are some of his sayings, some of his writings from his book. And if you look at these, it's quite interesting that he kind of developed the scientific method. For him, everything had to be mired in experimenting, and he was very adamant that a scientist should always question everything and question everyone. And which I mean, if you read it, it sounds very much like what you would have read from Galileo, for example. Experimental evidence was the support that he built everything on. And that's how his book was written, that's how experiments were written, and that's how he grounded his vision, his ideas of vision and light and color. And well, light has changed our understanding of the world, and the camera obscura have changed everything. The book of optics, it was the leading book of for light science for several hundred years afterwards. Now, let's fast forward 999 years, and that's 2014, basically. So what happened is this came up, which just to give you a little background information on what you're seeing. This is a machine that was announced by the Egyptian military while I was on holiday not too far from here. I was in Seattle. And so basically the machine, well, there are two machines. There's the one on the left, which is the diagnosis machine. It's this rod, and basically what it's supposed to do is that if it is able to diagnose hepatitis C, HIV, Ebola, and some types of cancer. Kind of works like a divining rod. If you have the virus, it'll just point to you. So if you walk into the room and you have the virus, that rod is supposed to point at you. And then that story evolved to have that other part on the right, which looks suspiciously like a phone booth, but it's actually a machine that is supposed to be able to treat these same diseases. So it can treat hepatitis C, HIV, Ebola, some types of cancers, MERS as well. And you might notice that there's a person in military garb there, and that is the inventor of that machine. And he's a very interesting person because he's the hero of this story in a way. So, So when I first heard about this, like I said, I was on holiday, and I thought that was a joke. It is funny. I laughed a lot about it, and then it became a bad joke that was not that funny anymore. And eventually, as this progressed, it actually became quite dangerous, I would say, and it ended up being, in my opinion, a complete disaster as well. And that's the scariest part about this kind of pseudoscience. It's just not enough to ignore it. I mean, you can't just ignore it and say it doesn't, it's just pretend it's not there, because it causes real damage. And I'll give you an example of how that happened. And I think that what happened was very much related to a monumental failure by media to actually hold this pseudoscience accountable and hold this person accountable for what he did. I think there are many people to blame, from physicians to researchers to government officials, but I would say that journalists, especially science journalists, bear the bulk of that blame. So what happened is when this was announced, you have to, put this in some context and background. So this was after the coup, which ousted the first elected president of Egypt post-revolution, and the military came on power, and the military was seen as the savior. So they removed the Muslim Brotherhood from power, and they were seen as the most stable institute in the country, and there was an extremely strong wave of nationalism sweeping the country. The military was the hero, the military was the savior, it was going to solve everything, and one of these things would have been disease. And a few months after this story, everyone well expected that the defense minister was going to run for the presidency, which he did. So often any media in the Middle East is mired in political undercurrents, and this issue, I think, was one of these. Like I said, under this background, it was unheard of that the media would stand up against the military. The media was hailing the military as the hero, as the savior, and everywhere, in every single TV channel, every radio station, every newspaper, this was all over the news, that they were solving everything, they were helping with everything. Now, the military had just removed the Muslim Brotherhood, and now they're going to solve one of the biggest health issues, which is hepatitis C, because Egypt has the highest load of hepatitis C in the world. And the media willingly became part of this movement that was hailing this discovery as the most important medical discovery ever. And these are some of the things that have been read. I think one of them is in English, the other is in Arabic. I don't know if you can see them very clearly, but it extended beyond the media as well. So, like I said, I think the media carries out of the blame, but doctors were failing to stand up for this. Researchers were failing to stand up for this. I remember that the previous director of the National Research Institute called it a scientific breakthrough, and this is the highest research institute in the country. He was completely attacked any critics who even came close to mentioning that this might not be true, that this might be bogus science. But like I said, the media caused most of the problems, and that is because the media gave an absolute platform for these people who were supporting this device. So everywhere you would turn on the TV or you get a paper, and you'd have them interviewing doctors who are saying that this treatment is being used, that it's been having incredible results, that the critics who are saying that this is pseudoscience are jealous of the success that the military have had with this discovery. So these are some of the questions that the media never asked. And I'm not saying that they should have asked every one of these, but even one of these would have been enough to disprove that story. And that's one of the things where I see that there was a failure in how the media approached this particular story. No one asked where that research was published. It was published in a predatory journal, and nobody, no references, no quality. It's absolutely crap paper. I basically downloaded a copy. I keep it just for laughs with when I have friends interested in science writing come visit. No one asked. So they were claiming that there was a patent. No one asked where that patent is. The patent clearly says that there's nothing substantial here. The patent that they applied for that device. Now, it got really bad when for the people who tried to speak out against this. So these are just two examples, two of the people who did try to speak out against this. So on the left is actually Bassem Youssef was the host of a very popular satirical show in Egypt. It was the highest rated show ever in the Arab world. He's been called the Egyptian Jon Stewart, but his audience is much bigger than Jon Stewart ever had. And when that machine was announced, he basically, the military said that in 30 days they were going to start treating people with it, and in every one of his shows, he'd have this counting down the days to those 30 days. And interestingly, before reaching the zero, the show was taken off air. And Bassem Youssef actually had to move to the US, and he can't go back now. And that was the most popular show, highest grossing show ever, and yeah, it was taken off air. On the right, this is a scientist that I've known personally, Assam Higgi, and he works in NASA, and he was on a sabbatical. He came back, worked as the science advisor to the president, and when this was announced, he called it an embarrassment to Egyptian science. And now he's back to the US and not welcome in Egypt anymore. So it gives you kind of an idea of the pattern it takes. So at the end of the day, there were 3 people who remained who were actually speaking out against this device. One scientist who lived in the US, he's an Egyptian but left in the US, and that made it a bit safer for him to talk. And one blogger, who's a person I knew after this event, and myself. And what we did is we actually banded together, the 3 of us, and we would give interviews, we would talk, we would retweet what we were doing, we would try to go out and try to speak to people. There was a press conference that the military was holding that I was banned from going to, but we try to get people in there so that we can actually get the word out about this. But at the end of the day, it was just 3 really, really tiny voices against, in a sea of media that was completely supporting this. And people who have known me for a very long time would just walk up and tell me, you must be an idiot, because look at that, everyone says that this is real. So just to wrap up and just to explain that the fallout of this, what was it like? So that time, I strongly believe that the media failed, and it was a disaster because what we had at the end was what you see here. There were thousands of people who were lining up for that treatment. Thousands of people who got so much hope that they would be treated from a disease that they've been suffering for their whole lives. Many people who have actually paid all the savings because they were promised that they would skip the line and go forward to that on the list of people who would receive that treatment. So while the media failed to step up to its role in this case, so did hundreds of researchers in the country and clinicians and physicians, and because just by remaining silent, and that was one of the biggest faults, that they didn't want to talk. And I understand. I mean, seeing what happened to a person like Assam Hegi, it scares you, and you just want to not get involved. But at the end, I think more was at stake than would have allowed them to be silent. And I have to go. Thank you.
Mohammed, Dina?
So, all right. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. When nationalism drives science. Before I share you my story about this topic, I would like to give you an overview about Indonesia. As you can see in this picture, Indonesia is a very big archipelago spanning from Indian Oceans to the Pacific. It consists of thousands of islands, which are homes to a very much diversity. It is estimated that more than 300 ethnicities live in Indonesia. Each has their own language and culture. So, Indonesia is also home with the world's major religions. And with such diversity, our founding fathers recognized that there was a need for common identity, and therefore they developed Pancasila. It's the 5 core values that unify the diversity. So now the diverse nations are under one nation is called Indonesia. So with this background, I think it's reasonable for us to think that the government and politicians use nationalisms as their political weapon. So they support anything that is nationalistic, including science. So I use the term nationalistic science here for science that tends to support the favor of one nation. We know that basically science is a universal quest of humanity. Science like gene editing technology, AI, the studies of particle physics, all of them are cutting-edge science that tries to answer the human's global problem and also human's curiosity. But mostly, they only happened in the developed world. In developing countries, the case can be different. Based on my experience in covering science stories in the southern part of the world, science that are needed by the people are a science that helps the people, that helps the people to solve their problems. And this is where nationalistic science came in. So if this is the case, then the government support that is intended to empower the nation is okay. For example, in Indonesia, the Ministry of Research and Technology has funded several projects on agricultural issues, traditional food, herb medicines, and that's a good thing. But however, if the science is intended for the support of nation pride, I think this could be troublesome. So this is my first case. The first case is Gunung Padang Pyramid. As you can see in the picture, it's a site littered by the piles of andesite columnar rocks. We know that geologically these rocks are natural products of ancient volcanic activities, but somehow a geologist came up and said that's not natural, that's man-made. He said the formations of the rocks are peculiar, and he did some geological research that looks rigorous. So this is the illustrations of the scientist's work, working with an illustrator. So hearing about this, the Indonesian government, at the time, it was President Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, enthusiastically visited the site and said that Indonesia is the cradle of human civilization. And he also created a government-supported research team to excavate this Gunung Padang site. And the most interesting thing is the president used the military to help the excavation, even though there was a protest from local people worrying about the ecological impact of the geological excavation. So what is at stake here? The lead researchers, Dani Hilmanata Wijaya, is actually a notable geologist. You can see here in his Google Scholar citations that he did some important research, like his research on the Sunda megathrust, on the Sumatran earthquake, on the tsunami in Aceh, there is certainly a beneficial research for Indonesian people. But now when he joined the team, we can see that his research priority was distorted. The second case is the Warsito cancer curing device. I think this is the case that is common in the world because there has been no cure for cancer. So Warsito here is an engineer. He did some research in Ohio State University, and with his college, he invented these technologies called the electrical capacitance photon tomography. And he came back to Indonesia. And apply it to his sister, a cancer patient. So he said that he based his device on this research, saying that alternating electric fields can stop the tumor cells dividing. So he used his technology, the so-called capacitive electricity, and apply it to his sister. So without peer-reviewed publication, he claimed that it was a success. And people start flocking to his lab. The governmental element of this case is that the Ministry of Trade and Industry awarded Warsito as Indonesia's best innovator. So what are the implications of this? Is this the people trusted him more and more, and the mainstream media covered him positively, even though there was objections from the Ministry of Health and doctors' associations. But because the support of the public was really, really big and significant, their efforts were not successful. So with this untested device, Warsito charged people for the renting of this device. So I think we all agree here that good science journalism is needed to guard where science will go. In the case of Gunung Padang, Indonesia's mainstream media, they already reported it in balance. They have enough criticism and they interview the experts to put the stories in a different perspectives. But however, for Warsito case, there is much of the stories is positive. There was a minimum element of science journalism in Warsito's coverage. So therefore, as a freelancer, I didn't have place to put my perspective in Indonesia's local media, so I put those cases to international spotlight, arguing that nation pride can drive us into the wrong way. So, if you want to know the end of the stories of the two cases, Gunung Padang excavations was stopped as the new president Joko Widodo came up. And the Warsito laboratory, I don't know about the causations between my article in Nature and this policy, but Warsito laboratory was closed by the Ministry of Health until said that it provides rigorous evidence on its efficacy. So, this is not the end of the story because more pseudoscience cases are rising in Indonesia, and it is often linked with nationalism due to the background I explained you in the beginning. So therefore, it's our homework as a science journalist in Indonesia to report science in a good way. Thank you very much.
Okay, so my name is Jason. I'm a Costa Rican journalist and PR specialist working for World Animal Protection in Latin America. This is my first time in the USA for more than 10 hours, so that's really exciting. What else? Let's wait for the slides. Are there? Okay. This is my first long stay in the USA. These are my hobbies: Latin dancing, piano, being a socially awkward introvert, and baking. So guess which one is keeping me nervous today? I want to talk about Santiago de Puriscal. This is a town in the province of San Jose with almost 13,000 people. And if you visit the Catholic temple of Santiago de Puriscal, the Santiago de Apostol Catholic temple, you would see evidence about the geological features that make this town a very important scientific research site in Costa Rica. This is my story on this subject. Santiago de Puriscal is the biggest landslide in Central America. Why is it sliding? The town was built on soft clay soil, and it was built on a hillside, which has been eroding throughout the years. The town is also riddled by severe seismic faulting that crisscross the town, and some of these faults are 30 kilometers long. There are rain and tropical storms that contribute to superficial groundwater, and this superficial groundwater means that the whole town is a 200 million cubic meter mass of soil that's sliding downhill as a fractured jigsaw puzzle. So the engineering department of the University of Costa Rica has proposed some solutions. The best one of which seems to be to create drainage tunnels underneath the town to help reduce the water levels in Santiago de Puriscal, and that way the town will sink slowly and will settle down. There have been similar projects undertaken in Costa Rica and in Europe, so we know this is a solution that works, and there is available funding to begin construction. So after my story was published, other outlets picked up on this story, and it's shown a light on the issue, and there have been small steps taken to limit the urban development in some areas of the town, but no big steps have been taken to solve the pressing issue of stopping this massive landslide occurring in Santiago de Puriscal. And my story was not the first time this problem has been talked about, because all reporting around the issue concludes that there's a lack of political will to advance major infrastructure projects that can solve this problem. So even though science has made it clear that there is a problem in this town, and that there are viable tested solutions to this problem, and there has been consistent reporting by journalists on this issue, there is a lack of will on politicians' behalf that means that they are giving the scientific community a cold shoulder to their research instead of taking action and investing in the safety of an entire town. So putting politics over scientific research is a repeated dynamic in Costa Rica. Since 1990, a world-renowned scientist, a seismologist called Marino Proti, has been alerting Costa Rica about an imminent earthquake that would hit the Nicoyan Peninsula in Costa Rica. And in September 5th, 2012, there was an earthquake in Nicoya, a 7.6 earthquake that hit the town, and it liberated 40% of the energy that was accumulated in the seismic fault system in Nicoya. So the city council, instead of recognizing the contributions of Marino Proti in improving our seismic code and helping us face the threats of imminent earthquakes with better infrastructure, they decided to censor this seismologist because they said he had created a climate of uncertainty and anxiety that had brought trouble to the region's economy and tourism and commerce. So what can be done? Because in strong democracies as Costa Rica, where an authoritarian government is unimaginable by people, even there we see that there is a trend of politicians ignoring and undermining the real contributions that science can make to the advancement of society. So I believe we do need more science journalists that are reporting in developing countries about these scientific issues and providing clear information on why science research is the most relevant tool we have to advance people's lives. We also need better science education. We need citizens that are better educated in basic concepts of science and understand why science works. We need ongoing science education, and we as journalists have the power and the privilege to provide ongoing science education to people well beyond their school years. So imagine how advanced societies would be if citizens everywhere fell in love with the elegance of the scientific method and understanding why it works and why it's a tool for good in society. And we need citizens everywhere to grasp an understanding of why science is the best tool we have for understanding our surroundings and providing happiness and equality and prosperity and well-being for citizens everywhere, so they can organize themselves and push governments towards taking better science-based decisions and actions. So to end on a positive note, I want to talk about the Amazon river dolphin. Since 2014, we at World Animal Protection began campaigning to stop the killing of nearly 1,000 river dolphins in Brazil. This river dolphin's flesh is used to catch piracatinga. This is a scavenger fish that swims the Amazon River, and it's sold under a fake name in Colombia called capaz. More than 1,000 of dolphins are killed to catch millions of dollars in piracatinga and export them illegally from Brazil to Colombia. And piracatinga contains high levels of mercury due to mining, which poses a threat to human health. So World Animal Protection and other local NGOs like Fundación Omacha have been organizing communities in the Amazon and in Colombia to help pressure the government to create effective change so that they could ban the trade of piracatinga. And this was achieved in August of 2017 after 3 years of campaigning based on the scientific research that was available at the time. And the government recognized the high levels of mercury in piracatinga, which helped to advance a complete ban of all trade in piracatinga, ending the killing of more than 1,000 dolphins every year and allowing the pink dolphin to swim freely and repopulate the Amazon River. Thank you.
Very short. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Let's wait for the slides. Thank you for staying until now. Here in the last panel, we were counting on you. And okay, I'm Carla from Brazil. First, I would like to say that I'm very glad and happy and honored to be here sharing this panel with such good journalists. It's a pleasure. And what I'm going to share here today is what the case of so-called cancer pill in Brazil. But to start with, a couple slides for context. First, I would like to say that Brazil today is a democracy officially, but past and recent events remind us that we can't take it for granted. Democracy in Brazil is very fragile, and we have to fight for it on a daily basis. Regarding science in Brazil, if we go back 7 years ago, we were going through a very good moment in science with a lot of resources, a lot of funding, a lot of enthusiasm. And a lot have changed since then. We're now going through a huge crisis in science with a lot of cut in budgets, a lot of scientists going abroad, and a wave of pessimism. But back to the so-called cancer pill. Actually, we're talking about a compound that is called phosphoethanolamine. And I'll use phospho for now on, just to make it simpler. Actually, it's a compound we have naturally in our body, especially in cell membranes and in mitochondria. But what I'm going to focus here is in the synthetic version of this compound, which is claimed to have anti-tumor power, and it has become a center of a big controversy in Brazil since 2014. But the story goes back to the beginning of the 19th, when this researcher, his name is Gilberto Chiaretti, he was a researcher in the Chemist Institute of the University of São Paulo, which is one of the biggest university and most important university in Brazil. And based on really preliminary studies that he made in cells and mice, he decided he could produce and distribute the substance for cancer patients without going through any clinical trials and without it being regulated for any of Brazilian organisms. And so it went on for almost 30 years in this university. Cancer patients would go there to get these pills to treat themselves. And when he retired in 2013, some months after that, the university decided to prohibit the production and distribution of this substance in the university. And of course, this made the patients very, they were not happy about this decision. Many of them were claiming to have benefits from this substance. And so they went public, they campaigned to have access to the substance again. And many of them ended up going to justice and getting warrants that obligated the university to produce the pill that was not tested nor regulated. And up to a point that the university didn't have any capacity to supply the demand, because then all of a sudden, many patients in Brazil started to go into the justice to get these warrants. And so doctors, scientists, and the scientific community in general react right away. There was a big reaction in the sense that they went to the media, they went to TV, they went to social media, reinforcing the importance of the scientific method, the phases, the trials, what makes the substance turns into a drug and everything. But what happened is that the government didn't pay too much attention to that, saying that they were listening to the people that wanted the substance to become a drug. The government decided to invest a lot of money in the Brazilian perspective, to study and test this substance. So 3 public laboratories in Brazil started testing it, and for about 1 year and a half, 2 years, and not any positive results came from this study so far. Some of them stopped because they were clinical trials and it didn't make sense to go on with some of these studies. But anyway, the Congress decided to approve a law that permitted the production and distribution of the cancer pill to patients that had cancer, but transferring to the cancer patients the responsibility. They would have to sign a term of consent where they declared that they knew that this substance wasn't tested and wasn't approved. So, but fortunately, the case ended up in the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court, right afterwards, suspended this law. And what happened was that there was a split in the research group that had access to the formulas and everything, and some of them went abroad to see if they could produce this substance and commercialize, and actually they ended up coming to the US and starting to commercialize this pill as a dietary supplement. But some of the ads still kept the relationship, the association with cancer, as you can see. And so what's happening now is that parliamentarian people in São Paulo, they're trying to put up a commission to inquire the studies that were made that showed no positive results, because they say that they weren't conducted in the right way. So that's what's going on now. And we're starting to see some campaigns by politicians that are putting the Phospho in their program. So there's been a political use of this substance. And the issue got a lot of media coverage. A lot of media outlets gave a lot of space to individual cases of people that were taking the pill and claiming that they were getting benefits from it. But I would say that the science journalists did a very good job in the sense of giving space and listening to what I think are the right voices and everything. But it didn't stop government and to take bad decisions, in my point of view, and either patients they still wanted the pill, of course. And so I think this case brings a lot of questions that we can debate. For example, I think we lacked a little bit of investigative journalism, since this big university was distributing cancer pills for patients for 30 years, and none journalists wrote about the story. And also, all of a sudden, the scientific method became very important. Why wasn't that important before? So how are we want to convince people all of a sudden that we really need to talk about the scientific methods, and usually they're not so focused in our stories and stuff like that. And also, I think we can debate how can science journalism really make a difference? Can we? How? Because I think we had a good job, but it didn't have much effect at the end. So I think there's some points we can try to discuss later. And this is one of the march in Brazil. Brazil also marched for science, and this is one of the posters, and I like to thank you very much.
Is this working? Sorry, podiums intimidate me slightly, so I hope you don't mind if I stand here, and I'll also give you a chance to stretch your necks, because you've all been looking that way. So hi, my name is Sarah Wild, and I am a South African-based science journalist, and I'll be talking to you about something non-controversial today. So I'll be talking about race and science. There we go. As I said, I'm based in Johannesburg, and I perpetrate journalism for a living. If you want to find out more about me, you can buy me wine or coffee. So this is South Africa in 1994 in April, and it was a great time in our country's history because this was our first democratic election. It was the first time that people of all color could vote and choose who they wanted their government to be. Before 1994, this was South Africa. It was a South Africa based on what you looked like and your race. It decided where you could live, what kind of jobs you did, the education you had, who you could love, who you could have sex with. And that was based on science. Well, people thought it was based on science. And thus we come to pseudoscience, which is a collection of beliefs or practices mistakenly regarded as being based on scientific method. It's culturally slightly different, so when I say pseudoscience in South Africa, we mostly think of tinfoil-wearing people who worried about falling off the edge of the flat earth. And in 2017, we call it scientific racism when someone says that different races have different characteristics based on science. And it's a pseudoscience. But if you go back to the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries, it wasn't pseudo, it just was science. And it was popular in all British colonies. And the US is one of those, as well as South Africa and Australia and others. And it was this strange meeting of scientific disciplines and prejudice and bias. Because in the 1700s, you had Carl Linnaeus developing taxonomy and breaking the natural world into discrete units. 1800s, you had Charles Darwin saying, well, you know, there's evolution, and humans are actually just a type of animal. And people put that together and decided that people could be distinguished into different types, and those types were called races, and it was fairly arbitrary, and that those races had values attached to them, with some races being better than others. And Europeans, white Europeans, being at the top of that, and in South Africa, the Bushmen, and in Australia, Aboriginal people being at the bottom of that ladder. And in the name of this science, which is now pseudoscience, we did really horrible things that showed people, well, reaffirmed people's own incorrect biases about their own superiority. And a very famous case is the drawing on your left. And that is a woman called Sarah Baartman, or Sarki Baartman, who was a Bushman woman who was taken to the UK and then to France as a museum curiosity. And when she died, she was dissected and stuffed and put on display. And she was used as an example of the different races and how different races had different value. And there are a number of examples of science like this in South Africa and in other countries. And the question we keep asking is, how do science journalists reflect their world? Well, what happens if your world is biased? What happens if that is the zeitgeist of your society and you reaffirm your bias with this hegemonic point of view? And so, race science is still very much evident today. It's evident in the way people interact. The things I hear as an African science journalist very often, well, you know, Africans just can't do technology. That's why you guys have problems. Or, have you gone and looked up black people and IQ? I've heard that at home, I've heard that in the US, I've heard that in Europe. And something that struck me is, in 1998, a man put out a paper in Lancet drawing a connection between autism and vaccination. And as a result of that, a lot of children and a lot of people are getting sick in this country and around the world. And it took 12 years before that paper was retracted. But what happens if the majority of the scientific community thought for decades that that races existed, and then that some were superior to others? And my concern when preparing for this panel is more a question of my own bias, of our own biases when we report, and how are we giving people power to do things like segregate, create apartheid, show people in different lights that are unfair, and what do we do about that? And in South Africa, we're arguing about this a lot. We tend to argue about things a lot in South Africa, and I think we quite enjoy it. And I don't know if you went to the Decolonizing Science panel yesterday. That's one of the issues that we're talking about. What are our own biases? And so we need science journalists because we know the science and we can debunk nonsense. But we also need diversity, and not just to be PC. We need diversity because people of different opinions and people who are different from us show us our biases that we may not even be aware of. And so, to finish within time, that's even better, I didn't expect that to happen. By calling something pseudoscience, we distance ourselves from our mistakes. And things that were once science endure because people think that somehow it's more valid because it once had science's protection. And those are the ideas that we need to ask ourselves if we're perpetrating.
So we have about 15 minutes for questions, and there are microphones here in the aisles. And we'll go ahead and start. Yes.
Question, as in the process of reporting risky stories, did you face any personal safety issues? Did you receive threats? How do you calculate how far you should go in pushing these stories before you need to pull back and take care of yourselves?
Do you want to start, Mohammed?
Yeah, happy to. Yeah, so that's an interesting question. For me, I think working on this story was the first time that I felt unsafe working on a science-related story. So I always thought that, yes, I mean, political stories, they get a lot of trouble, but I mean, as science journalists should be fine. But that was the one story where I actually started having people calling me up and telling me that I should back down because they were getting worried about what I was doing. These calls were from friends who were worried, but what happened is, two other things that happened is I would get angry messages on my Facebook from people I don't know. And then I would get these fake accounts that have been created 2 days ago or 3 days ago, adding me as a friend on Facebook and following me and following what I write, which was quite worrying for me as well.
Okay. So yeah, I'm a freelancer. So on those two cases that I just explained in my presentations, like for the Warsito case, in Indonesia, the media is like I have told you before, the media is like very careful in reporting in the story. And because they are too careful, they just report the positive side. I ever wrote a column, an article to the Jakarta Post, and they rejected it because I proposed a different perspective, saying that this Warsito's device is a pseudoscience, and they rejected it. And so there has never been science story on that device. And therefore, I go to Nature. So it's a column, so because it's international and they have their high standards of editing, they take care of the legal issues. So they told me to be careful, and I collected the legal documents that Warsito had given me. So I collected it in the folder. So if there is anything coming, I will have that as my backup. But however, after the publications, the two scientists contacted me. One of them said, like the geologist said, that this is a defamation, and he quite angry about it. And I approached him nicely and said that it was a column, it's a subject of criticisms and interpretations. And after a dialogue, he says, okay, I just gave comment to the article confirming about my scientific biography. It's like something like that. You have to approach the scientists nicely too, even though it doesn't mean that you agree with them.
In Costa Rica, I think it's scientists who face the biggest threat. Journalists can be threatened or questioned. Their professionalism can be questioned by the government, by people who have special interests. But I think it's scientists and environmentalists who face the biggest threats because of what they're doing with the information they have on their hands.
Okay, in Brazil, so far, I think in covering this type of story is not so risky yet. But I mean, the feeling is more of being ignored than to be at risk, which is not as bad as, but I mean.
In apartheid South Africa, you got banned, you fled. In democratic South Africa, you can call your president a corrupt bastard on the front page and you're fine. The greater danger is more witch hunts online. If you say things that people don't agree with or that upset people, and often that has to do with race, then you wake up to a million tweets calling you the most horrible names or contacting your employer. That can happen. So social media is more the danger for many people speaking about science.
Yeah, that's a good point. Palab?
First of all, thank you for 5 brilliant talks. I'm totally in awe of your journalism. This is what science journalism should be, so well done to all of you. I just wanted to make... the observation that it's not just in authoritarian regimes where you have pseudoscience. I don't really need to remind people that we have someone in the White House here and in both houses of Congress that don't believe in climate change, and no amount of science reporting has changed that. In the UK, the government has authorised a policy of killing badgers in the southwest of England, even though rigorous studies have shown that actually, to stop the spread of TB in cattle, not for the sake of it, even though studies have shown that it's actually going to increase TB. There's been lots of science reporting on that. It's been ignored. The National Health Service gives homeopathic remedies, so it just happens everywhere. And I think it's not to do with the science. It's to do with politics and what people think and what they believe in. And so to Carla's point, you know, your frustration about not changing anything, I mean, I suppose all I can say is that it definitely won't be changed unless you do some of the great journalism that you've all been doing. But I do have a question, which is, do you think that it is worse in authoritarian regimes that the amount of pseudoscience and science journalism is needed more?
Sarah, you want to start this time?
No, I was actually just thinking about the question. So your question is whether authoritarian regimes need it more. I think it might be harder in authoritarian regimes, so you have to try harder, but I don't know about the need being greater, because if you are in a democratic or open society, you have a greater breadth of views, and people are more inclined to believe something or false evidence, as opposed to just an authoritarian regime or government saying something. You have a multitude of sources where information can come from. Does that make sense? Yeah. Do you have something to add?
I think we need more and better, I think, in all the regimes right now. I think, like, for example, in Brazil, I get the feeling that science journalism is getting better. Science journalists are better trained, but there's too little. We don't get too many. So there's a lot of other type of coverage of the same topic by other outlets that have no science journalism, and it is very different. So I think not just in authoritarian regime, but everywhere we need more and better.
Yeah, I agree it's needed everywhere. The thing in democratic countries is that since there is a multiplicity of voices speaking, this creates a lot of noise that drives the conversation to a place that is not scientifically based. So in authoritarian regimes, when science journalists push, they push hard, and they effect change hardly, and they face great risks, but they push hard. Whereas in democratic countries, when science journalists push hard, they're met with a lot of confrontation and a lot of voices that try to silence them out or dilute their discourse.
Okay, so I think whether it is authoritarians or a more democratic society, I think the key players is not only the government and the journalists, but it's also about the public. So if you have the public that has a good standards of scientific literacy, then this public, they can play a role. They can use the social media and make noise in that. And that's where the journalists can have insights on their reporting. And I think democratic people, democratic nations, I think they have a higher chance of having the science being good.
Yeah, I guess just to add to that, I don't think that pseudoscience is exclusive to authoritarian regimes, but what I do think is the main difference is that I don't think that anyone should take the freedom of press for granted. The moment we do, that's the moment when we actually lose it. But I would have loved when I was working on that story to at least have an equal playing field, level it up. But the point is, it was just a humongous fight against this very strongly state-controlled media that was propagating this with only 3 fringe voices that they were absolutely adamant to flood out with all that noise that was happening. So just if the playing field was leveled, that would have been fine for me. That would have been good, but it wasn't.
Akin?
Yeah, thank you for the presentations, and it shows a lot of commonalities, across borders. You've been able to chase the cancer drugs out of perhaps Brazil, and it has landed in the US. I'm looking at, when you look at, I want to go back into history, HIV/AIDS, there are people who said they had a cure across Africa, Nigeria, Kenya, and a number of journalists stood up to address, the issue that this is not, what it really is. And of recent, we have issue of polio vaccine and stuff like that, religious leaders becoming scientists saying that this has, some ingredient that's really is not good enough for humans and so on and so forth. I'm just wondering, when you become the lone voice, and there are other medium, being positive about the pseudoscience, what drives you? You realize that you are the only one, and people are querying you even within the newsroom and calling you, names and stuff like that. What is really the driving force, for you to continue doing that story? And do you resort to looking at a couple of other people, if you have science journalists within the country, in a way that you look at this thing, this is an issue that we need to address? What drives you to pursue some of these stories? Thank you.
Any of you want to take that up, Carla?
Well, I think each story is its story, but I mean, in this case of the cancer pill, I thought it was just so unfair to the cancer patients, and it drove so much hope and involved so many emotions, and I thought it was very unfair. And I felt that we need to talk about this very seriously and keep the hopes in where they should be, because these people are suffering.
Dina, did you want to?
Yeah. Okay, sorry.
As journalists, we are in such a privileged position. You can pick up a phone and you can sit across from someone and you can ask them the most personal questions you can imagine. And then you take that and you turn it into a story and you put it on a platform. And there's so much power in that. And the people who are duped are the vulnerable. It's always the vulnerable who get hurt. It's the poor, it's the sick. And you have the ability to help those people. And that's what makes it so important, is because we have this privilege and we should use it to help others.
Yeah, so I think the driving force of continuing the reporting is that the first thing is the uncomfortable feeling of seeing something's wrong. So I have to continue this reporting because this is pseudoscience and people need to know about that. And the second one is you think about what is at stake at this case. If that is about the health of millions of people, then you should continue.
I'll just add to that very quickly. I think for me, part of it was anger. I was very angry at being so helpless, and that was the only thing I could do. But I think the other part is that I genuinely believe that this can be extremely dangerous. It can, like I said, when this started for me, it was a joke. I was laughing about it. I was sharing this on WhatsApp with my friends and we were laughing. But by the end, it was actually quite scary and it was quite dangerous. And I think it just worries me because with issues like health, you just play on people's despair and people's needs, and that's a powerful thing to be playing on, and a powerful way to control emotions. And I think I just, for me, it was just the idea that I'll just do whatever I can, and I was hopeless most of the time when I was doing it, but it just made me feel at least I'm doing something rather than not taking part in this.
And for me, currently as an animal welfare campaigner, telling these stories is much more about effecting change, positive change in society, and letting people know that every small victory amounts to bigger victories in the future. So being able to tell good stories about how people are making change in their localities inspires others to bring forth change in their own places. So I think that's the importance of telling these stories once and again, and we as journalists have the opportunity, privilege, and must muster the courage to keep telling these stories so other people can be better informed and make better decisions.
And we have time for one more question. Sadir?
I want to preface this by saying that I found all of your stories inspirational, and the work that you do is obviously important. But I want to question or at least point out an assumption that I think underlies something that all of you said, which is that we need more journalism, more science journalism. I think that's based on a particular model of how the public and policy and journalism connect and influence each other. And I think we've seen in a lot of cases which are related to pseudoscience, for example, tobacco or the creationist movement here in the US, that more knowledge isn't necessarily enough. So what I want to ask is, do we really need more journalism and more awareness of that, or is what we need more PR, as ugly as that sounds? More sort of targeted marketing propaganda to change people's minds and not just to inform them?
That is a really interesting question. Who would love to take that up first?
Okay, so I think, oh my gosh, I'm gonna get in trouble. So I think we do need more journalism, more responsible journalism. In Costa Rica's case, science journalism is growing, but we need to have more of it and devote more investment and space in our newspapers, in our TV stations, in our radio stations, etc. But as a campaigner and a PR specialist, I'm gonna have to say we also need organized society to be more vocal about effecting change, because if organized society is not vocal and doesn't raise their voice and says evolution is a fact and you know, things like that, racism is bad. If people in the right side of history are not speaking up and are not putting these stories in a global platform for everyone to understand why this is the right side of history, then we're going to be flooded out by negative ideas and creationism and Donald Trump. Okay.
So, okay, I want to add some ideas. So I think PR wouldn't work. Why? Because the adult people knows that it's a PR and they already have biases. So what works better, it's in science education. So just like what I previously told you, that the key players is not only a journalist, government, but also the public. So how we can educate the public? It's the scientific literacy from the kids. I think this is the most important thing. If you do PR, that will do nothing, because adult people are smart enough to know that it's a propaganda, that they have already their own bias, like people with the religions. If she doesn't believe in evolution, no matter how much professors talk to her, she will believe that evolution is propaganda, something like that. So PR wouldn't work. Good science journalism is needed, and scientific literacy should be improved.
I agree with my colleagues. I think, as Jason and Tina pointed out, science education is really needed, and scientists, journalists alone won't do it. And I also think that we need more information, because we see that the information is not getting to everyone as it should be. But I also think that in different levels, science somehow has to find better connections with politics, because what I feel in Brazil is that scientists are used by politicians. When they want the data to support their decisions, they go and they support scientists and they go and give money to them. But when the scientists want to say something different than what they're deciding, they're just ignored. So I feel this, and we have many cases in Brazil that we can show that. So this case, science was ignored because of other political interests. So somehow, I don't know if we journalists can do something about it, but I feel it's something that is needed.
As a journalist, my first responsibility is to my reader. So when I assimilate all of the facts, it's my role to be critical so that I can do good by my reader. PR's first responsibility is to the person paying for the PR. And so it's a question of that message and who is trying to look out for the interests of that reader. And I would argue, by some strange chance, that science journalism would be the way to do that.
Yes, I might add to that quickly. I think that's a very interesting question, actually, and I think that there's definitely the need for more journalism, and in a way, I believe that journalism will be involved in, I wouldn't call it PR, and I'm not sure that's exactly what you had in mind, but I mean, it would be involved in educating people better about the science. And I think that when I say we need more journalism, I also think that we need to think about how we approach this smartly. So I look back at my reporting on that particular story, and sometimes I think if maybe at least a few people completely blocked me out before even hearing what I was saying because I gave the impression that I was opposed to the military. So maybe I could have approached it a bit smartly, differently from how I did. Maybe I could have approached it without bringing the military into the picture, just focusing on the science. Maybe that could have been different. Maybe I think that afterwards, when I look back, I think that in a few cases, I might, if I'd done that, I would have been, some people would have listened to me who would not before that. But I also think that we should be fighting to be more involved in policy, really, and ultimately that's a very important role that for the media or for journalism that is often undermined in authoritarian regimes. And if there's anything we can gain under these regimes, it would be to be more involved in policy so that we have science-informed policy taking place rather than being sidelined and completely ignored from these decisions that are being taken.
I want to close this by picking up on a phrase used by Pallab Ghosh from the BBC, in which he described your stories and the stories of your work as inspirational. And one of the reasons that I absolutely love being part of World Conferences of Science Journalists is that it reminds me that I'm part of this network of science journalists around the world who, just like me, think this matters, push back when they see wrong being done. Don't give up. Keep trying to tell the stories that matter. And to me, this is one of the most inspiring things that I get out of these meetings. And this particular panel, I think, exemplifies that it's not just us in the United States or in South Africa or in Brazil or Costa Rica or in Indonesia or in Egypt, but this is something we share and work on together. So I'd like to thank this extraordinary panel. And its exceptional organizers from our neighboring country of Mexico. And all of you for staying late and being part of this conversation. Thank you so much.